I wasn't the kind of person who believed in miracles. I believed in bills, in medical charts, in numbers that didn't lie when the bank called multiple times a day to remind us of our ruin. On Christmas Eve, while the rest of the world gathered around warm hearths and decorated trees, my father signed me away to clear his ledgers. But the cold husband who took me in didn't ask for my submission. He bought me a greenhouse. He gave me the home my father had spent my entire life tearing down. Before they fell in love, they signed a contract. Mine was quiet, like a held breath that no one dared to release. The snow outside Marcus Reed's law office fell in thick, heavy sheets, burying the bustling streets of the city under a pristine layer of white ice. I sat in a high-backed leather chair that smelled faintly of antiseptic polish, bitter espresso, and stale ozone, watching the flakes collide with the leaded glass. It was only 4 o'clock in the afternoon, but the winter sky had already bruised into a deep, impenetrable twilight. Down below, faint streetlights illuminated pedestrians rushing home with brightly wrapped packages, their shoulders hunched against the biting wind. Up here, on the 40th floor, there was no festive music and no ambient holiday cheer. There was only the rhythmic, metallic clatter of the old cast-iron radiator in the corner. A steady knock, a heavy hiss, another knock. I fixated on that mechanical rhythm. I anchored my entire consciousness to the peeling white paint of the heating pipes, using the mundane repetition to ground myself, so I wouldn't shatter into 1,000 pieces right there in the leather chair. The cold glass of the window pane radiated a sharp chill against my right shoulder, a stark contrast to the suffocating, stale warmth trapped inside the room. I traced the frost patterns with my eyes, wishing I could disappear into the white-out beyond the glass. Choices vanish quickly when your father leaves behind more debt than memories. Julian Vance sat beside me, though we might as well have been separated by a frozen ocean. My father stared blindly at his own hands. His shoulders slumped beneath the worn fabric of his gray suit. He did not look at me. He had not looked at me since we stepped out of the elevator lobby an hour ago, unable to meet the eyes of the daughter he was trading away. On the broad mahogany desk in front of us lay a stack of thick, cream-colored legal documents, the transfer ledger. That was what Marcus called it, his voice completely devoid of inflection, treating the destruction of my autonomy as nothing more than a standard corporate merger. It was a heavy, terrible manuscript of my family's failure, a meticulous accounting of every reckless gamble, every unpaid loan, and every secret Julian had kept hidden until the banks threatened prison. Across the desk stood Arthur Sterling. If my father was a man hollowed out by his own desperate gambles, Arthur was a figure carved entirely from winter stone. He wore a dark, heavy wool suit that seemed to absorb the dim light of the office, his posture immaculate and utterly still. He didn't gloat over his acquisition. He didn't offer a patronizing smile, a triumphant sneer, or a false reassurance that everything would be all right, which somehow made the reality of the transaction even heavier. He simply watched the proceedings with a quiet, detached observation, his dark eyes entirely unreadable beneath the harsh fluorescent lights. He was purchasing a bride to balance a ruined financial empire, absorbing Julian's catastrophic, multi-million-dollar losses in exchange for my absolute, legal compliance. I had expected a tyrant, a man who relished the power of owning someone else's life. But Arthur radiated a vast, imposing emptiness, a silent gravity that pulled everything into its orbit, without demanding a single thing. Marcus Reed cleared his throat, a dry, papery sound that cut through the oppressive tension in the room. He adjusted his gold-rimmed glasses and slid a heavy silver fountain pen across the polished wood toward my father. The metallic nib caught the pale clinical light of the desk lamp, gleaming like a surgical instrument prepared to make a fatal incision. Julian picked it up. For a fraction of a second, his knuckles turned white, and his hand trembled against the dark wood. I watched that slight tremor, my chest tightening as a foolish lingering piece of childhood hope flared to life. I waited for a sudden reversal. I waited for a tearful plea, for a father's sudden realization that he could not trade his own flesh and blood to save his shattered pride. I waited for him to push the paper away, to tell them that we would find another way, even if it meant ruin. No miracle came. The pen met the heavy parchment, the dry, Scratching sound of ink carving into paper filled the silence of the room. It was a terrible final noise. With every deliberate stroke of his signature, he erased another year of my life, binding me to a man I barely knew to settle debts I did not create. The transfer ledger absorbed the wet ink, sealing away the last remnants of Clara Vance's independence beneath layers of legal jargon and financial clauses. I kept my eyes locked on the radiator. The metallic knocks hissed into the silence. The dry heat radiating from the iron did nothing to warm the freezing ache spreading through my chest. I refused to cry. I refused to give Marcus the satisfaction of witnessing my humiliation, and I absolutely refused to let Arthur see me as a helpless, broken victim. I locked up my jaw, holding onto my dignity like a physical shield, breathing in the dry dust mote-filled air of the law firm in shallow, measured gasps. My mother, Helena, had always told me that grace was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let it dictate your posture. Helena had spent her life cultivating life from dirt, coaxing fragile roots to hold in the harshest winters. She was a woman of quiet, resilient strength, and when she passed, the warmth of our family died with her. I channeled her memory now, anchoring my spine against the leather chair. I would not bend. I kept my posture rigidly straight, mirroring the unyielding stone of the man standing across the desk. When Julian finished signing the last page, he placed the pen down with a dull tap that echoed like a gavel strike. He stood up slowly, retrieving his damp overcoat from the back of his leather chair. Still, he did not meet my gaze. He buttoned his coat, nodded once to Marcus, completely ignored the tall, imposing man, who was now legally my husband, and walked toward the heavy oak door. The latch clicked open. The brass hinges groaned softly in the quiet space, a hollow, mournful sound, and then the door closed behind him, the heavy thud echoing against the wood-paneled walls. He was gone. Just like that, the transaction was executed with chilling efficiency. I was entirely alone, left behind as collateral in a room full of strangers. Marcus neatly gathered the scattered pages of the transfer ledger, tapping the edges against the desktop to align them perfectly, as if my entire future could be neatly stacked and filed away. He slipped the heavy documents into a thick leather folio and snapped the brass clasp shut. The sharp metallic sound signaled the definitive end of my old life. I sat frozen in the chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, waiting for the inevitable instructions. I expected orders. I expected this cold, untouchable tycoon to dictate the terms of my imprisonment, to remind me of the staggering financial burden he had just lifted from my family's ruined name. I waited to be told how I was expected to behave, what duties I was required to fulfill, and how I was to repay the fortune that had just saved my father from a prison sentence. Arthur slowly buttoned his suit jacket, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He looked down at me, his gaze dropping briefly to my white, strained knuckles, then lifting back to my face. The intensity in his dark eyes was mesmerizing. Yet it carried no malice. "The car is waiting," he said. His voice was low, deep, and devoid of the sharp cruelty I had braced myself for. It was merely a quiet statement of fact, wrapping around the cold room like a heavy shadow. He did not offer his hand. He did not tell me to smile. I stood up, my legs feeling entirely disconnected from my body, like I was moving underwater. I didn't speak. I simply nodded once, gathered my thin wool coat from the armrest, and followed him out of the impersonal office and down into the unforgiving snow. The journey north into rural Maine took 4 hours. The blizzard intensified as we left the city limits, transforming the world outside the tinted windows into a chaotic blur of white and pitch black. The snow did not fall in delicate, festive flurries. It drove against the windshield in violent, horizontal sheets, an aggressive force of nature that seemed intent on burying the vehicle alive. For hours, the headlights carved a narrow, fragile tunnel through the suffocating darkness. The heavy SUV moved silently through the storm, the rhythmic thumping of the windshield wipers providing the only steady beat in the suffocating quiet. I sat in the back seat, pressed as far against the freezing glass as physically possible, staring out into the darkness. Arthur sat beside me, a vast, silent expanse of dark fabric and unyielding posture. We did not speak a single word. The silence in the vehicle was not the tense, aggressive quiet of a pending argument. It was a heavy, oceanic stillness. I watched the distant city lights completely fade from the rearview mirror, replaced by the towering, jagged silhouettes of dense, snow-covered pine forests. The isolation of the landscape pressed in on the glass, severing me from everything I had ever known. The city, with all its debts, its failures, and its broken promises, was vanishing beneath a thick blanket of winter snow, leaving me adrift in a void I could not navigate. The ambient heater in the car hummed softly, yet I could not stop the faint, involuntary shivering in my shoulders. My damp coat offered little protection against the deep, bone-deep chill that had settled in my blood since Julian walked out of that office. I folded my arms tightly across my chest, willing my body to be still, terrified that displaying any physical weakness would give him leverage over me. Arthur did not comment on my trembling. He did not turn to look at me, nor did he offer false platitudes about the cold. He merely reached forward and pressed a small silver button on his door panel. A moment later, a surge of warm air flooded the floorboards beneath my leather boots, wrapping around my freezing ankles. It was a silent act, entirely practical and barely noticeable, yet it forced a tiny crack in the tight protective shell I had built around myself. He was paying attention. He noticed the tremor I was trying so desperately to hide. By 7 in the evening, the vehicle slowed, turning off the main highway onto an unplowed, winding gravel driveway. The heavy stone estate emerged from the winter fog like an ancient, forgotten fortress. There were no ostentatious iron gates displaying a wealthy family crest, no blinding floodlights illuminating manicured lawns. There was only raw, stark stone, steeply pitched slate roofs, and narrow leaded glass windows, glowing with a faint amber warmth against the violence of the blizzard. It looked less like a modern billionaire's mansion, and more like a quiet sanctuary sitting at the very edge of the world. The towering pine trees bowed under the weight of the snow, standing like silent sentinels guarding the perimeter of his solitary domain. The sheer scale of the estate should have been terrifying, a vast monument to isolation. But as I stared at the amber light spilling from the narrow windows, a strange, inexplicable pull settled in the center of my chest. Some places don't wait to be found. They call to you in silence. The tires crunched to a halt in the deep powder. The driver opened the heavy door, and the biting Maine wind howled into the cabin, carrying the sharp, crisp scent of crushed pine needles and frozen earth. I stepped out into the ankle-deep snow, bracing myself for the oppressive reality of my new existence. I pulled my thin coat tighter around my neck, staring up at the imposing stone facade, fully expecting a cold, unwelcoming prison designed to remind me of my exact worth on a ledger. Arthur walked ahead of me, his heavy boots leaving deep, precise tracks in the fresh snow for me to follow. He pushed open the massive, solid oak front door without waiting for a butler or staff to announce our arrival. I stepped over the threshold, pulling my coat tighter around my chest, fully expecting a barren, intimidating foyer, lined with cold marble floors and priceless, untouchable art. Instead, I was met with the deep, resonant crackle of a massive hearth. The entrance hall was vast but incredibly warm, constructed of dark, hand-hewn timber and aged, uneven flagstone. A large fire roared in an enormous stone fireplace, casting long, dancing shadows against the wood-paneled walls. The air inside the manor smelled intensely of burning cedar wood, old paper, and a faint, soothing trace of peppermint. There was no staff lined up in perfect rows to greet the new bride. There were no curious maids whispering in the corners, no harsh overhead lighting, displaying unearned wealth. The house was entirely empty, steeped in a profound, heavy quiet that felt entirely different from the clinical silence of the law office. This silence did not demand an explanation or force a confession. It felt like a thick, heavy blanket draped over a wounded room, offering absolute stillness to anyone who needed to heal. It was a space designed for someone who valued peace above all else. Arthur shrugged off his snow-covered overcoat, hanging it on a wrought iron hook near the entrance. He turned to me, his dark eyes scanning my shivering, exhausted frame. I stood awkwardly in the center of the foyer, melting snow dripping from my boots onto the ancient flagstone, my small suitcase gripped tightly in my numb, trembling fingers. I was waiting to be told where to go. I was waiting for the boundaries of my confinement to be drawn, for the rules of the house to be dictated in a sharp, uncompromising tone. "Follow me," he said quietly, turning toward the grand wooden staircase. I climbed the steps behind him, my damp shoes making soft, uneven sounds against the thick woven runner. The corridors were long and dimly lit by brass wall sconces, the shadows feeling heavy with history, yet impeccably maintained. The scent of beeswax and old wood lingered in the air, wrapping the hallways in a sense of timeless permanence. We reached the end of the eastern wing, far removed from the main living spaces, stopping before a solid wooden door. Arthur reached out and turned the brass handle, pushing the door inward. He stepped aside, leaving plenty of space in the hallway, ensuring his massive frame did not block my path, allowing me to enter first. I walked cautiously into the room, my guard raised to its absolute maximum height, bracing for a lifeless, impersonal guest room, or worse, a gilded, suffocating master suite that would immediately solidify my role as his purchased property. I stopped dead in the center of the woven rug, my breath catching painfully in my throat. The room was a quiet sanctuary. The walls were painted a soft, muted sage, glowing warmly under the gentle light of a small brass bedside lamp. A fire was already crackling in the private stone hearth, filling the space with the comforting scent of dry wood smoke and lavender. But it was not the beautiful architecture that stole my breath. It was the specific haunting details. Lining the wall beneath the frosted window was a low, custom-built oak bookshelf. My eyes scanned the spines, tracing the worn leather covers and faded gold lettering. They were my books. Not just generic literary classics purchased by an interior designer to fill empty space, but the specific, obscure botanical encyclopedias and fragile poetry volumes I had been forced to sell to a secondhand shop months ago when Julian's debts first consumed our accounts. They were all here, carefully arranged, dusted, and waiting for me. I turned to Arthur, the question caught heavily in the tightness of my throat. How could he possibly know? How could a man who merely bought a name on a ledger care enough to track down my discarded, worthless belongings? I searched his face, looking for the trap, looking for the arrogant smirk of a man demanding gratitude. He did not wait for my question, nor did he seek gratitude or offer explanations to leverage my affection. He simply walked past me toward the heavy mahogany bed. Resting neatly at the foot of the mattress was a thick, deeply warm woolen coverlet, woven in dark, rich threads. I stood shivering near the doorway, the damp chill of the Maine blizzard still, clinging to my thin coat and soaking through my clothes, making my joints ache with cold. My jaw trembled slightly, an involuntary betrayal of my severe physical exhaustion after hours of maintaining my stoic facade. Arthur turned, holding the thick covering in his large hands. He bridged the distance between us, his footsteps completely silent on the thick carpet. I froze in place, my instincts screaming at me to step back, to reject any physical proximity from the powerful man who now owned my life on paper. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for a demand, a possessive touch, a harsh reminder of the contract we had just signed in that cold office. Instead, I felt a sudden, enveloping weight settle gently over my shoulders. I opened my eyes. Arthur had draped the heavy wool blanket carefully over my trembling frame. His large hands rested for only a fraction of a second on the thick fabric near my collarbone, ensuring it covered me completely and blocked out the chill. He didn't linger. He didn't brush my skin or stroke my hair, stepping back immediately to create a respectful distance between us. The comforting scent of winter stone and cedar wood washed over me, mingling with the deep sheep wool warmth of the heavy blanket. He walked over and glanced at the brass thermostat on the wall, adjusting the dial upward with a quiet click, ensuring the room would remain perfectly heated through the bitter holiday night. "There is a lock on the inside of this door," Arthur said, his deep voice barely above a murmur, entirely devoid of any harsh or commanding edge. "Use it." Before I could process the massive weight of his words, he turned and walked out into the dimly lit hallway. He did not pull the heavy wooden door completely shut. He left it slightly ajar, a silent, profound declaration that I was not a prisoner in the stone fortress. I was allowed to close it myself. I was allowed to lock him out. I stood alone in the center of the warm, firelit room, clutching the edges of the heavy folds tightly beneath my chin. The silence of the estate wrapped around me, but for the first time in years, I did not feel entirely unmoored. I looked at the cracked spine of my favorite botanical journal resting on the shelf, then back to the open door, My father traded my life away to save himself. But the cold man who bought me had just given me the warmth to survive the night. Morning came to the estate without a single sound. The transition from the deep, bruising darkness of Christmas Eve to the pale reality of Christmas morning was not marked by the cheerful clamor of a household waking up. There were no distant voices echoing in the corridors, no clatter of silverware from a busy kitchen downstairs, and absolutely no festive music drifting through the heavy floorboards. There was only a slow, creeping shift in the quality of the light, filtering through the frosted panes of my bedroom window. The pale, slate-gray illumination brushed against the edges of the woven throw that Arthur had draped over my shivering shoulders the night before. I lay completely still in the center of the massive mahogany bed, watching a few stray dust motes drift lazily through the cool air of the room. The fire in the private stone hearth had burned down to a pile of glowing, ash-covered embers hours ago, leaving behind the faint, comforting scent of dry wood smoke and aged cedarwood. I had not slept for more than a few fractured minutes at a time. I had spent the entire night caught in a state of hypervigilant paralysis, staring at the ceiling, waiting for a heavy footstep in the corridor. I had braced myself for the brass handle of my door to turn, for the inevitable arrival of the man who now legally owned my future. But the lock I had pointedly refused to engage remained entirely undisturbed. The cold, unreadable tycoon who had purchased my life to settle. Julian's catastrophic ledgers had left me entirely alone in the quiet dark. I pushed the thick woolen covers aside, the sudden exposure to the chilly morning air making the fine hairs on my arms stand up. I dressed quickly, pulling on a thick-knit sweater and the same dark trousers I had worn in Marcus Reed's clinical law office the previous afternoon. The fabric still felt tainted by the sterile, bureaucratic reality of the transfer ledger, but I had nothing else. I walked over to the custom-built oak bookshelf beneath the window, running my fingertips lightly across the worn spines of my recovered botanical encyclopedias. The tactile reality of the rough leather and faded, gold lettering grounded me, proving that last night had not been a stress-induced hallucination. Arthur Sterling had somehow tracked down the obscure, fragile pieces of my past that my father had so carelessly pawned away. I pulled my hand back, my chest tightening with a confusing, uncomfortable pressure. It was far easier to endure cruelty than it was to process unexpected kindness from a captor. Kindness demanded a response. Kindness blurred the clean, sharp lines of a financial transaction. I needed to move, to walk, to find a physical space where my racing mind could finally catch up to the reality of my new existence. I stepped out of the bedroom and into the long, dimly lit eastern corridor. The stone floors were icy beneath my thick woolen socks. The immense house felt less like a billionaire's modern playground and more like an ancient, abandoned monastery. As I wandered through the grand, shadow-drenched hallways, I realized with a sudden jolt of clarity that there was no staff. There were no housekeepers dusting the antique sideboards, no private chefs preparing a lavish holiday breakfast, and no security details lingering by the exits. Arthur lived here in total, absolute isolation. The scale of his solitude was staggering. I navigated a sweeping wooden staircase that groaned softly under my weight, eventually finding myself in a sprawling, utilitarian mudroom at the back of the estate. A row of heavy winter coats hung from iron hooks, and several pairs of scuffed, mud-stained boots sat neatly on a rubber mat. Beside them was a heavy oak side door with a simple deadbolt. I pulled my thin, inadequate wool coat off the hook, where I had left it last night, wrapped a scarf tightly around my neck, and turned the brass latch. The air outside hit me like a physical blow. The main winter did not merely exist, it attacked. The blizzard from the previous evening had exhausted itself, but it had left behind a brutal, freezing fog that hung low over the heavily forested grounds. The temperature was well below freezing, the kind of absolute, biting cold that instantly numbed the exposed skin of my cheeks and made every breath feel like inhaling crushed glass. I stepped off the stone porch, my boots sinking past my ankles into the pristine, unbroken crust of the overnight snowfall. I forced myself to walk, pushing through the deep powder, needing the violent physical discomfort of the cold to distract me from the suffocating anxiety in my chest. The towering pine trees stood like massive, silent sentinels, their dark green branches bowing heavily toward the earth under the weight of the ice. The fog distorted all sense of distance and direction, wrapping the estate in a thick, isolating shroud of white. I walked aimlessly for several minutes, my joints aching, my toes rapidly losing sensation inside my leather boots. I was just about to turn back and admit defeat to the winter when a strange, diffuse glow caught my eye through the dense mist. I paused, wiping a layer of frozen condensation from my eyelashes. About 100 yards away, sitting at the edge of the tree line, a large structure was emerging from the fog. As I pushed through the final snowdrift, the silhouette sharpened into an enormous, steaming greenhouse. It was a beautiful Gothic piece of architecture, constructed of dark wrought iron and towering leaded glass windows. The contrast between the environment outside and the structure itself was jarring. The exterior of the glass panes was coated in a thick, jagged layer of white frost, while the interior was slick with heavy, dripping condensation. Plumes of warm, white steam escaped steadily from a series of brass vents along the pitched roof, fighting a losing battle against the freezing Maine air. I stood in the snow, shivering violently, staring at the unexpected sanctuary hidden in the frozen woods. The faint muffled hum of an industrial heating system vibrated through the snow beneath my boots. I reached out with a trembling, numb hand and gripped the heavy iron latch of the greenhouse door. I pressed my weight against the metal, pushing it inward. The sensory transition was instantaneous and entirely overwhelming. A solid wall of intense, humid heat washed over my freezing face, carrying a scent profile so specific and so deeply buried in my past that my brain could not immediately process it. It was the rich, heavy smell of damp peat moss, crushed pine needles, and the sharp, medicinal fragrance of blooming rosemary. The warm, thick air rushed into my lungs, carrying the unmistakable, earthy sweetness of winter lavender. It was the exact, precise scent of my mother's hands. The sheer olfactory assault bypassed every logical defense mechanism I had painstakingly constructed over the last year. The frozen rigidity I had worn to survive my father's betrayal simply dissolved in the warm air. An ugly, ragged sob tore its way out of my throat. It was not a delicate, quiet tear of romantic sadness. It was a raw, guttural gasp. The desperate sound of a woman who had spent months holding her breath, suddenly finding a pocket of breathable oxygen. I pressed the heel of my hand hard against my mouth, my shoulders shaking uncontrollably beneath my damp coat, weeping for the mother I had lost, for the home that had been taken from us, and for the sheer terrifying relief of standing in a warm room. It took several minutes for the violent tremor in my chest to subside. I wiped my face roughly with the back of my sleeve, taking slow, deep, shuddering breaths of the rosemary-scented air to ground myself. I opened my eyes, finally looking past the entrance to absorb the staggering scale of the interior. The steaming greenhouse was massive, easily the size of a commercial nursery, yet it felt entirely intimate and deliberate. Row upon row of elevated, dark wooden planter boxes stretched down the central aisle, bathed in the soft, diffused morning light filtering through the condensation on the leaded glass windows. I walked slowly down the brick pathway, my wet boots making no sound. I reached out, my trembling fingers brushing against the silver-gray stalks of a massive rosemary bush. I recognized the specific tight curl of the leaves. I moved to the next box, trailing my hand over the fragile, feathery fronds of a dense patch of chamomile. My heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against my ribs. These were not generic, identical clones purchased in bulk from a commercial landscaping company. The stalks were thick, gnarled, and deeply scarred by previous pruning shears. They were old, they were survivors. I turned down a narrow side aisle, my breath catching painfully in my throat, as I stopped in front of a sprawling, elevated bed filled entirely with winter lavender and rosemary. The familiar, chaotic arrangement of the rootstocks was exactly as it had been at our old home, before Julian's creditors had seized the property. Resting gently against the damp, dark soil in the center of the planter was a small, hand-painted wooden sign. The pale blue paint was chipped and weathered from years of exposure to the sun and rain. I reached out, my fingers shaking so badly I could barely trace the elegant, sloping letters spelling out my mother's name, Helena. I stared at the worn wood, the sheer logistical impossibility of its existence crashing over me like a physical weight. My childhood home had been foreclosed on nearly 8 months ago. The bank had locked the gates, seized the assets, and sold the sprawling gardens to a commercial developer who had explicitly slated the land to be bulldozed for a subdivision. My mother's life's work was supposed to be buried under concrete. For these mature, fragile rootstocks to be sitting here, thriving in a custom-built, climate-controlled sanctuary in rural Maine, someone would have had to intervene directly with the bank. Someone would have had to hire a specialized botanical team, dig up the dormant plants from the freezing mud in the dead of winter, transport them across state lines, and meticulously replant them in this steaming glasshouse. I heard you cry. A low, steady voice rumbled from the far end of the central aisle. I didn't like it. I gasped, spinning around, my hand flying to my chest. Arthur Sterling stepped out from behind a towering wall of broad-leafed ferns. He was not wearing the immaculate, intimidating dark wool suit that had made him look like a corporate executioner the day before. He wore a faded, heavy gray knit sweater, the sleeves pushed up past his elbows to reveal thick forearms that were visibly dusted with dark potting soil. He wore worn denim and heavy mud-caked work boots. In his right hand, he held a small dirt-stained steel trowel. He did not look like a ruthless billionaire who had just purchased a bride to balance a ledger. He looked like a man who had spent the entire night fighting the frozen earth with his bare hands. He didn't advance on me. He stayed exactly where he was, keeping a wide, respectful distance. He didn't offer a patronizing smile or demand that I wipe the remaining tears from my face. He simply watched me with those intense, dark eyes, his posture entirely relaxed, projecting a quiet, steady calm that anchored the frantic energy in the room. "How?" I whispered, my voice cracking, gesturing weakly toward the hand-painted wood section sign resting in the soil. "The bank. They locked the gates. They were going to destroy the South Plot." "They tried," Arthur replied smoothly, his tone conversational, completely devoid of any boasting or arrogance. He walked slowly toward the planter box, his boots scuffing softly against the damp brick floor. He stopped a few feet away from me, his gaze dropping to the sprawling patch of winter lavender. "I sent a logistics team to the property the day after I reviewed your father's final debt portfolio. We secured the rootstocks just before the heavy machinery moved in. They've been in transit for a week. We finished the replanting at 3 o'clock this morning." I stared at the side of his face, my mind struggling to comprehend the massive, silent effort he had orchestrated behind the scenes while I had been sitting in my room, terrified of his cruelty. He had not bought me a diamond necklace. He had not showered me with expensive, meaningless gifts to buy my compliance. He had quietly, methodically reached into the wreckage of my shattered life and pulled out the only thing that had ever truly mattered to me, preserving it in glass and steel so I would not have to grieve it again. Sometimes love doesn't knock, it waits. Arthur did not stand over me waiting for praise. He did not ask for a smile, a tear, or a sudden declaration of loyalty. Instead, he crouched down carefully beside the long wooden planter box. He reached out his large, soil-stained fingers, gently touching a specific cluster of silver-gray lavender leaves that were drooping sadly against the damp earth, their edges turning a sickly, brittle yellow. He knelt there in the damp soil, looking completely unguarded, leaving the next step entirely in my hands. "The soil acidity is wrong," Arthur stated quietly, looking back down at the struggling, withered stem rather than at my face. "I adjusted the phosphorus levels in the fertilizer mix last night, but the root system is still rejecting the transplant shock." He paused, his thumb lightly brushing the fragile, dying leaf. He looked back up at me, his expression open and waiting. "Tell me how to fix it." I stood in the warm, humid air of the steaming greenhouse, listening to the soft hiss of the overhead vents and the steady, rhythmic dripping of condensation sliding down the leaded glass windows. The cold, transactional contract that had bound us together less than 24 hours ago suddenly felt entirely irrelevant, completely dissolved by the smell of wet soil and the sight of this formidable man kneeling in the dirt, asking for my help. He had not brought me to this isolated estate to act as a prisoner, a trophy, or a debt payment. He had built this sanctuary so that I could have a safe place to grow, and now he was simply waiting for me to take the lead. I took a slow, deep breath of the rosemary-scented air, feeling the last remaining knot of panic in my chest finally loosen and unravel. I took a step forward, closing the distance between us, and knelt down in the damp soil beside my husband. I pressed my bare knees directly into the damp earth beside the long wooden planter box, completely ignoring the sudden, biting chill that seeped through the thin fabric of my dark trousers. The soil beneath my hands was densely packed, heavy with stagnant moisture, and far too alkaline for the fragile, traumatized root systems of the winter lavender to survive the brutal shock of their relocation. I reached deeper into the elevated bed, sinking my trembling fingers past the superficial top layer of dirt to feel the actual temperature of the root ball itself. It was suffocating in the dark. My mother, Helena, had always taught me that plants, much like people, rarely died from being violently uprooted. They died from being forced into environments that demanded they change their fundamental nature without giving them the necessary space to breathe. I pulled my hand back slowly, rubbing the gritty, wet earth between my thumb and forefinger, analyzing the dense texture as the familiar, medicinal scent of crushed rosemary grounded my racing thoughts. Arthur knelt perfectly still beside me, a massive, unmoving presence in the heavy, humid air of the steaming greenhouse. He did not demand an immediate, highly efficient botanical solution. This story doesn't rush. It lingers in quiet rooms, between unfinished words, in the spaces where love is found without being spoken. He simply waited, his dark eyes locked intensely on my muddy hands, deferring entirely to my lead. "The clay content is far too high," I whispered, my voice still slightly hoarse and fragile from the raw, ugly tears I had shed only moments before. I kept my gaze focused entirely on the dark dirt, terrified that if I looked directly into his face, the delicate, unspoken truce we had just established would shatter into 1,000 pieces. Lavender needs to drain properly. It needs to struggle just a little bit to find the water, or the roots will simply rot in the dark. We need to turn the earth completely over, break up the density of the clay, and fold in perlite and source sand to aerate the entire bed. Arthur did not question my assessment, nor did he ask for a secondary, professional opinion. He merely nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement of his chin, and reached behind him for the heavy burlap bags of soil amendments, stacked neatly near the iron heating vents. For the next 3 hours, the steaming greenhouse became a silent, synchronized sanctuary of deliberate, exhausting physical labor. We did not speak of the heavy transfer ledger that sat securely in Marcus Reed's sterile law office. We did not speak of Julian Vance, or the staggering, catastrophic financial debts that had legally chained my life to his. We communicated entirely through the rhythmic, repetitive motion of the steel trowel slicing through the dark earth and the heavy thud of sand being folded into the peat. I worked systematically down the left side of the long wooden planter, carefully loosening the compacted dirt around the traumatized root clumps, while Arthur mirrored my exact movements on the right side. I watched the tactile contrast of his large, calloused investor hands as he meticulously and gently tamped down the fragile potting soil around a drooping seedling without crushing its delicate stem. These were hands built to completely dismantle massive corporate empires. These were hands that routinely signed away millions of dollars with a single, ruthless stroke of a silver fountain pen. Yet, they moved with an impossible, breathtaking reverence among my late mother's dying plants. He treated the fragile stems not as property he had legally purchased, but as something profoundly sacred that he had been entirely entrusted to protect. The ambient heat of the glasshouse was intense, a heavy, humid weight that completely banished the brutal, freezing Maine blizzard. Raging just beyond the frosted panes, the rigorous physical exertion of turning the heavy, wet soil sent a deep, radiating warmth through my chest, slowly melting away the residual, bone-deep ice of the previous night's terror. I paused my work, sitting back on my mud-stained heels to stretch the dull, throbbing ache in my lower spine. Without thinking, I brought the back of my wrist up to wipe away a stinging bead of sweat from my forehead, accidentally dragging a thick streak of wet, dark mud directly across my left cheekbone. Arthur stopped moving immediately. The steady, rhythmic scraping of his steel trowel against the brick boundary of the planter ceased entirely, leaving the massive space completely silent save for the soft, mechanical hiss of the overhead steam vents. I froze in place, my breath catching painfully in my throat, as I felt the sudden weight of his dark eyes lock onto my face. The absolute stillness in his broad shoulders triggered a momentary, terrifying spike of my old defensive panic, the urge to run. I fully expected him to point out the humiliating mess. I braced myself for a dry, sarcastic comment about the ruined state of my appearance, or a harsh reminder that the legal wife of a billionaire should not be kneeling in the dirt. Looking like a common, unkempt laborer, I locked my jaw, preparing to raise my emotional shields back into place. Instead, Arthur set his dirt-stained trowel down on the damp bricks. He shifted his weight, closing the small, safe gap between us until the intense heat radiating from his chest became a tangible force against my cold skin. He reached out slowly, his massive, soil-covered hand hovering just a fraction of an inch from my face. "Tell me to stop," he murmured, his deep voice vibrating with a raw, undeniable vulnerability. The words hanging between us as a quiet, steady choice. I couldn't speak. My vocal cords felt completely paralyzed by the sheer, unyielding intensity in his dark eyes. I simply shook my head, a fraction of an inch, refusing to step back, refusing to rebuild the wall between us. Arthur exhaled a long, unsteady breath that ruffled the stray hairs near my temple. He raised his hand, carefully avoiding the wet mud, coating his own fingers, and used the soft, perfectly clean edge of his thumb to gently wipe the dark smudge of soil from my cheek. The contact was electric. A sudden, searing point of friction that burned straight through the heavy, defensive layers of caution I had worn for the past year. He let his hand drop to his side immediately, his gaze dropping to the freshly restored lavender plant sitting between us, leaving the sheer weight of his silent care hanging heavily in the humid air. By noon, the deep, satisfying physical exhaustion of our shared labor had settled firmly into my bones, a grounding fatigue that I had not experienced in many long, terrifying months. We left the steaming greenhouse together. Walking side by side through the narrow path, Arthur had methodically carved into the deep snowdrifts, retreating back toward the imposing stone facade of the main estate. The biting winter wind whipped violently against my damp clothes, but the cold no longer felt like a deliberate, isolating attack. It was merely weather, entirely separate from the quiet, protective gravity of the man walking silently beside me. We entered the manor through the heavy oak side door, stepping directly into the sprawling, rustic kitchen at the rear of the massive house. The space was a stark, comforting departure from the sterile, clinical luxury I had fully expected, from a man of his immense corporate wealth. The floors were laid with wide, uneven planks of reclaimed timber, and the massive center island was topped with a thick, deeply scarred wooden butcher block, rather than imported, polished marble. The warm scent of burning cedarwood drifted in from the main hearth in the foyer, mingling beautifully with the faint, metallic tang of the melting snow dripping steadily from our heavy winter boots. I walked over to the deep brass basin beneath the window, turning the heavy iron faucet to wash the thick, stubborn layers of potting soil from my raw, stinging hands. Arthur stood a few feet away, leaning quietly against the wooden counter, watching the steaming water run over my knuckles. The silence between us was no longer the heavy, suffocating quiet of a helpless hostage and her wealthy captor. It was deeply peaceful. It was the quiet of a shared, hard-won sanctuary. A delicate, newly formed boundary line, permanently drawn against the chaos and cruelty of the outside world. He reached past me, turning off the iron faucet before taking a clean linen towel from the rack and handing it to me. I dried my hands slowly, the rough texture of the fabric grounding me in the present moment. Without a word, Arthur moved toward the heavy iron stove. He retrieved a rustic, chipped ceramic mug from the open shelving, an imperfect, humble object that looked entirely out of place in a billionaire's estate, yet felt utterly perfect in his large hands. He began to boil water, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Within minutes, the sharp, earthy aroma of ginger and the soft, floral notes of chamomile filled the kitchen air. He poured the steaming liquid and set the mug gently on the wooden butcher block in front of me, wrapping a thick cloth napkin around the hot ceramic so it wouldn't burn my fingers. He then retreated to the opposite side of the island, pouring a simple glass of water for himself. We did not speak. We didn't need to. That quiet cup of tea became our unspoken vow, a silent truce that held the freezing world at bay. For the next 6 days, the sprawling Maine estate became an airtight fortress of quiet, domestic routine. The brutal winter blizzard continued to rage outside, burying the property under several feet of pristine, untouched white snow, and effectively cutting us off from the noise of the city. I spent my hours wrapped securely in the plush blanket Arthur had left on my bed, sitting by the roaring hearth in the library, with my Relatos encyclopedias resting on my lap. I did not ask about the status of the transfer ledger. Arthur did not attempt to force a conversation about my father, Julian Vance. He spent his time splitting firewood, tending to the heating vents in the greenhouse, and simply existing in the same room as me, content to let the silence do the heavy lifting of healing our fractured trust. But the fragile sanctuary could not last forever. It finally broke on the late afternoon of New Year's Eve. The storm had momentarily paused, leaving a cold, eerie stillness over the forest. I was sitting in the library, tracing the faded spine of an old poetry book, when the sudden aggressive crunch of heavy tires on the gravel drive shattered the quiet. I stiffened instantly, my heart kicking into a frantic, terrifying rhythm. The isolation of the estate was absolute, meaning no one simply stumbled upon this property by accident. I stood up, letting the heavy layers slip to the floorboards, and moved quietly toward the towering leaded glass windows. A sleek black luxury SUV was idling near the front steps, entirely out of place against the rustic, snow-draped backdrop of the winter forest. Arthur stepped into the foyer from his study, his broad shoulders instantly hardening into unyielding winter stone. He did not look at me, but he positioned his massive frame subtly between the heavy front doors and the library entrance, establishing a silent, physical barricade to ensure whoever was outside could not reach me. The heavy brass knocker echoed sharply, a violent, demanding sound that bounced off the timber ceiling beams. Arthur pulled the door open, letting a vicious gust of freezing wind sweep into the warm house. Standing on the stone threshold, wrapped tightly in an expensive cashmere overcoat, was Gideon Thorne. Gideon was a notoriously ruthless corporate rival of Arthur's, a cynical man who viewed every human interaction as a calculated power play. He was the exact man who had originally introduced Julian to the illegal high-stakes offshore investments that had completely destroyed my family's legacy. He had spent years desperately searching for a weakness in the sterling financial empire, and now a triumphant, venomous smile twisted his sharp features. "Merry Christmas, Arthur," Gideon sneered, his voice loud and invasive, dripping with an arrogant mockery that made my stomach aggressively churn. He stepped uninvited into the foyer, shaking the loose snow from his tailored shoulders. "I hope you and your newly purchased collateral are enjoying the deep freeze. I always thought you were a man who did his exhaustive due diligence before acquiring a failing asset." Arthur remained perfectly still, a towering wall of dark steel, blocking Gideon from advancing any further into the house. "You are trespassing, Gideon. State your business and leave. I found the secondary ledgers this morning." Gideon continued, his tone elevating into a theatrical, mocking pitch that echoed terribly against the stone walls. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his heavy coat, tapping it against his palm like a weapon. Julian didn't just lose the money to incredibly bad market bets. He committed federal fraud, and he systematically embezzled from his own subsidiaries to cover his tracks. The massive debts you absorbed in that transfer ledger are legally tied to an illegal black hole. I gripped the heavy oak doorframe of the library, my knuckles turning entirely white as a massive wave of paralyzing nausea washed over me. I completely stopped breathing, my chest locked in a vice of pure, unadulterated terror, waiting for the beautiful illusion to end. The fragile peace I had found in the greenhouse shattered instantly. "By the end of the week, the board will have the original documents," Gideon threatened, leaning closer to Arthur, his eyes glinting with malice. "They will expose Julian. They will drag his ruined name through the mud, and by extension, they will completely ruin you for legally tethering your pristine empire to a criminal's daughter. Unless, of course, you void the marriage contract immediately and throw her out." The manor seemed to tilt wildly on its axis. This was it. This was the exact moment the beautiful illusion ended. Arthur was a titan of industry who relied entirely on his pristine, untouchable reputation to maintain his immense power. No man would willingly absorb federal fraud and public humiliation for a woman he had met barely a week ago. He would be furious. He would cast me out into the snow, completely legally justified in discarding a contract built entirely on my father's lies. I braced myself for his righteous rage. Arthur stood terrifyingly still. He did not yell. He did not offer Gideon a single word of defense, nor did he attempt to frantically negotiate a delay to save his company. He did not even look at the manila envelope in Gideon's hand. Instead, Arthur finally spoke, his voice a low, incredibly dangerous rumble that carried absolutely no fear. "Are you finished?" Gideon frowned, clearly caught off guard by the total lack of panic. "I am giving you a chance to save your own skin, Sterling. Burn the contract, toss the girl, or I burn your firm to the ground." Arthur took a slow, deliberate step forward, forcing Gideon back toward the freezing threshold. "You falsely believe that noise equates to power, Gideon. Let me be perfectly clear. Let the board have the papers. Go to the press tomorrow. I am entirely capable of absorbing the financial impact of Julian Vance's cowardice without breaking a single sweat." "You're insane," Gideon spat, his confidence faltering against the sheer, immovable weight of Arthur's indifference. "You will lose millions. You will lose the board's trust over a worthless debt bride. She is my wife," Arthur stated, the words falling like heavy iron anvils onto the stone floor, vibrating with an absolute, uncompromising authority. "And she is not an asset up for negotiation. If you ever approach my property, my firm, or my family again, I will not just dismantle your portfolio. I will erase your name from this industry permanently. Now, get off my land." Arthur didn't wait for a response. He gripped the heavy oak door and slammed it shut with a violent, definitive force, severing Gideon Thorne from our sanctuary and plunging the foyer back into a deep, vibrating silence. The absolute silence that followed, the heavy slam of the oak door, felt thick enough to suffocate me. The violent echo of Gideon Thorne's departure vibrated through the heavy timber ceiling beams, slowly fading into the crackle of the roaring hearth. I remained frozen in the shadows of the library, my hands gripping the edge of the wooden doorframe so tightly that my knuckles ached. The crushing shame of Julian's federal fraud threatened to pull me entirely under. I had braced myself for the inevitable backlash, fully expecting the towering man in the foyer to turn around, his dark eyes finally flashing with the righteous, calculating fury of an investor who had just realized he had purchased a ruined asset. I waited for the cold clinical reality of the transfer ledger to reassert itself, for the demands of compensation, for the immediate eviction into the freezing Maine night. Arthur stood with his broad shoulders facing the heavy front door for a long, quiet moment, his breathing slow and entirely even. When he finally pivoted to face the dim light of the corridor, his expression was completely stripped of the untouchable corporate steel he had worn against his rival. He did not look angry. He simply looked at me, his jaw set in that unyielding stone, a man quietly bracing himself for the storm he had chosen to meet. He didn't speak. He didn't demand an apology for a crime I did not commit. He merely held my gaze with a quiet, profound gravity, then turned and walked slowly toward the open doors of his private study. I could not simply let the silence stand. The cognitive dissonance of his sacrifice was too massive, too terrifying to process without breaking the quiet. My father had traded my entire life away to save his own skin, treating me as nothing more than ink on a balance sheet. Now, a billionaire I had met barely a week ago was casually preparing to face a multi-million-dollar corporate scandal, risking his pristine reputation to shield my dignity. It defied every cynical law of survival I had learned over the past year. I pushed myself away from the doorframe, my legs trembling, as I followed the sound of his heavy boots down the hall. I stopped at the threshold of the study. The room smelled of old leather, bitter ink, and the faint, ever-present trace of cedarwood. Arthur was standing behind his massive mahogany desk, the warm light of a brass reading lamp casting long, quiet shadows across his face. He reached into the bottom drawer and pulled out the thick leather folio that Marcus Reed had sealed in the law office on Christmas Eve. He set it on the polished wood, his large hands resting gently on the brass clasp. "Why?" The word tore its way out of my throat, raw and fractured, completely lacking the proud, guarded elegance I usually fought so hard to maintain. I am a bought bride. You just absorbed a federal embezzlement scandal for a woman you purchased on paper. You have the legal right to void the contract right now. You have the right to throw me out. Why are you doing this? Arthur looked down at the leather folio, his jaw tightening slightly. The silence in the study stretched out, heavy and expectant, filled only by the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. When he finally looked up at me, the formidable, stoic tycoon was entirely gone, replaced by a man carrying a grief so deep and unhealed that it physically resonated in the room. My mother died of the exact same illness that took Helena, he said, his deep voice dropping to a low, rough murmur that seemed to absorb all the oxygen in the space. I completely stopped breathing, my defensive walls freezing mid-assembly as the sheer, unsuspected vulnerability of his confession washed over me. She was a quiet woman, he continued, his gaze drifting back to the brass clasp of the folio, his thumb tracing the cold metal. She loved the earth. She loved the smell of wet soil and the way the morning light hit the frost. When the illness finally took her, I was already wealthy. I had endless resources, a massive portfolio, and a battalion of specialists on my payroll, but none of it mattered. I could buy hospital wings, but I could not buy her a single extra day. I had to watch the world strip away the only sanctuary she had left, completely powerless to stop it. He exhaled a long, unsteady breath, the sound incredibly loud in the quiet room. He lifted his dark eyes back to my face, stepping away from the desk, closing the distance between us, until he was standing only a few feet away. When my analyst began reviewing Julian's failing ledgers, I saw the foreclosure notices on your family's estate, he explained, his tone completely devoid of pity, replaced instead by a fierce, quiet devotion. I saw the botanical plots slated for destruction. I saw a man willingly dismantling the last remnants of his late wife's sanctuary to cover his own cowardice. I couldn't save my mother's garden, Clara, but I could save yours. A hot, stinging pressure built rapidly behind my eyes. The absolute certainty in his voice completely shattered the transactional narrative I had clung to for survival. I did not purchase you, he whispered, his voice vibrating with an intense, unyielding sincerity. I bought the debt to build a wall around you, so that the people who only saw you as a number on a ledger could never, ever touch you again. You are not an asset. You are my wife. And you are safe here. He didn't reach out to touch me. He didn't demand an emotional collapse, a tearful embrace, or a grand declaration of gratitude to validate his massive sacrifice. He simply turned back to the mahogany desk, picked up the heavy leather folio containing our legal bondage, and walked past me toward the hallway. "Come with me," he murmured. I followed him in a silent, stunned daze. We walked through the winding corridors, passing the mudroom, and stepped out into the freezing Maine night. The storm had broken, leaving the sky a vast bruised purple, the towering pine trees standing like silent witnesses in the deep snow. We crossed the freshly shoveled path, the frigid air biting at my cheeks, until we reached the heavy iron door of the greenhouse. The transition from the bitter, isolating cold to the heavy, humid heat of the glass sanctuary was immediate. The thick, medicinal scent of crushed pine needles, damp peat moss, and blooming winter lavender rushed into my lungs, instantly grounding my frantic heartbeat. Arthur did not stop to admire the thriving rootstocks we had spent hours saving. He walked directly to a large, empty wooden planter box situated at the far end of the central brick aisle. The box was filled with dark, dormant soil, waiting for the spring seeds. He unclasped the leather folio. He pulled out the transfer ledger, the thick, cream-colored legal parchment that dictated the exact financial terms of my surrender. I fully expected him to turn around and march us back to the manor, to dramatically throw the pages into the roaring stone hearth in a fiery, cinematic display of rebellion. But Arthur Sterling was not a man of fleeting, destructive melodrama. He was a cultivator. He was a man who understood that true healing required slow, methodical transformation. He gripped the top of the heavy legal document, his massive, calloused hands flexing. With a sharp, decisive pull, he tore the pristine pages perfectly in half. The harsh sound of ripping paper cut sharply through the soft, ambient hiss of the overhead steam vents. He placed the halves together and tore them again and again. He methodically shredded the toxic contract into hundreds of small, irregular ribbons, stripping away the bureaucratic language of my father's betrayal until it was nothing more than meaningless pulp. When the entire ledger was reduced to scraps, he dropped the handfuls of torn paper directly into the dark, damp soil of the empty planter box. He looked at me, a silent invitation resting in the depths of his dark eyes. I stepped forward, my hands trembling as I reached into the soil. I plunged my fingers into the wet, dense peat, grabbing the shredded pieces of the contract and folding them deep into the earth. We worked side by side in the warm humidity, our hands moving in a quiet, synchronized rhythm, mixing the ink-stained paper into the heavy dirt. The thick parchment would eventually decompose in the dampness. It would break down, turning the suffocating legal chains of my past into rich, necessary compost to aerate the soil for a new bed of winter lavender. It was the most profoundly practical, healing act I had ever witnessed, a tactile, permanent transformation of trauma into life. We did not need a dramatic kiss or a loud, tearful confession. The absolute destruction of the contract in the soil was our real vow. 2 weeks later, the deepest part of the January freeze settled over the rural Maine estate. A massive, impenetrable winter storm had rolled down from the northern mountains, dumping several feet of fresh powder over the dense pine forests and completely severing the property from the rest of the frantic, transactional world. The isolation was absolute, but for the very first time in my life, the physical barrier did not feel like a cold prison. It felt like a heavy, protective shield. The late afternoon light was already fading, turning the sky a deep, melancholic gray. I stood in the sprawling, rustic kitchen, the wide planks of reclaimed timber warm beneath my thick woolen socks. The massive house was entirely quiet, devoid of the aggressive, forced cheer that usually accompanied the holiday season in my old life. There were no flashing lights, no lavishly wrapped boxes containing meaningless diamond necklaces, and no sterile corporate parties to endure. There was only the steady, comforting ticking of the antique clock on the wall, and the soft, muffled thud of heavy snow pressing against the frosted panes of the windows. Arthur stood near the iron stove, his broad shoulders relaxed beneath a faded gray knit sweater. He reached for the heavy cast iron kettle, the soft whistle of the boiling water cutting through the peaceful silence of the room. He moved with a deliberate, unhurried grace, retrieving the rustic, chipped ceramic mug from the open wooden shelving. He did not use the fine, imported porcelain tucked away in the formal dining room. That fragile china belonged to a world of empty promises and polished lies. The chipped mug was imperfect, weathered, and enduring, exactly like the sanctuary we were quietly building from the splinters of our pasts. I watched as his large, capable hands carefully measured out the dried herbs we had harvested together from the greenhouse earlier that week. He crushed the chamomile flowers slightly between his fingers to release their essential oils, adding a few thin slices of fresh ginger to the steep. The sharp, earthy aroma immediately bloomed in the warm kitchen air, a scent that tasted exactly like the safest parts of my mother's memory, yet felt entirely grounded in my present reality. He poured the steaming water over the herbs, wrapped a thick, folded cloth napkin around the base of the hot ceramic, and carried it over to the deeply scarred wooden butcher block where I was sitting. He set the mug gently in front of me, the aromatic steam rising in a slow, graceful ribbon. I did not ask for a thank you. He simply poured a plain glass of water for himself, walked around the center island, and stood beside me, leaning his hip against the heavy wood, perfectly content to share the quiet space. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into my skin. We eventually migrated into the library, where the massive stone hearth was roaring with a fresh stack of split cedar logs. I sat in the corner of the plush leather sofa, pulling the familiar dark coverlet over my lap, tucking my feet beneath the thick fabric. Arthur sat in the deep armchair beside me, a heavy, worn historical biography resting unopened on his knee. He was looking out the leaded glass windows, watching the violent, blinding whiteout conditions of the blizzard rage against the reinforced glass, entirely unfazed by the chaos outside, because the inside of our world was completely secure. I took a slow sip of the hot chamomile tea, the soothing floral warmth sliding down my throat and settling deeply into my chest. I looked at the man who had bought me, on the coldest night of the year, the stoic tycoon who had shredded $1 million contract to compost a garden, and the quiet protector who had completely surrendered his pride just to ensure I had a safe place to breathe. He had not simply paid off a ledger. He had given me the exact thing Julian had spent my entire life tearing down. I didn't need a grand, sweeping declaration. I didn't need a public ceremony to validate my worth. I just needed him sitting quietly beside me, a towering wall of winter stone, holding the entire freezing world at bay while I drank my tea in peace. Home isn't a place or a name. It's a person. And as the last pale light of the winter afternoon faded behind the snow, leaving us wrapped in the amber glow of the fire, I finally set my chipped mug down, leaned my head against the back of the sofa, and allowed myself to close my eyes. For the first time in a very long time, I had absolutely no reason to run. If this quiet story found a safe harbor in your evening, please leave a like and subscribe to sit with us again.